Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel at the Spatial Data Science Conference. So I have with me today 4 amazing panelists that will be going through an amazing topic, so new types of data for innovative spatial modeling. So my name is Alejandra Aranzadi, and I am Data Partnerships Manager at CARTO. I will ask these 4 panelists to introduce themselves. So Eva, go ahead.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Eva Murray. I'm a senior evangelist with Snowflake, and excited to be part of this panel talking about all things geospatial.
Thank you, Eva. Ryan.
Hi, Brian Ferriman, senior data scientist at Geospatial at Charter Communications, part of their wireless product strategy group.
Thank you, Ryan. Saif.
Hi, Saif Ahmed, Director of Developer Relations at Kinetica, and also former Director of Engineering at Kinetica.
Thank you, Saif. And Eugenie.
Hi, everyone. This is Eugenie Chen. I am the VP of Data and Analytics at Vistar Media. We are a programmatic platform for the data pool.
Perfect. Thank you all. As this topic is pretty intense, and I'm sure we all have a lot to say, we're going to start right away. So my first question, just to start, would be like, what are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to finding new location data? What challenges do you find your company when looking for new types of location data?
Sure, I can take this one. I think the biggest challenge with new data is you're trying to find the right balance of scale, cost, and quality. If the data set is not really going to cover your company or organization's entire territory, then the data set really doesn't fit your need. You generally don't want to be piecing together data from different vendors to try to get full coverage. Then cost becomes obviously a key factor. Ideally, you want to be able to find a data set that's pre-existing off the shelf so that you're simply one of many customers footing the vendor's cost of collecting that data. But the challenge is if you really are pushing into new areas and new types of data, then you may find that you really are the first person asking for this or the first one buying it. And that'll really drive the cost higher. But then the third factor is quality. If the data set is collected poorly or not at the resolution you need, then that can make the data unusable. And you do have to do a lot of vetting to make sure that the data will meet your needs. But the flip side of that is you also don't want to pay for data that's too good. If someone's trying to get 0.5 meter resolution when 10 meters would have been plenty accurate enough, that's usually driving your costs higher. So you're trying to find, ideally, something off the shelf that's just the right resolution and just high enough quality to meet your need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anybody wants to?
I just wanted to say I like that example of going too granular, because I think there's that tendency of stakeholders to want all the detail, and it's a good point in time to challenge them back and say, what are you going to do with it? Because then you or we as the data experts can say, hold on, like for what you want to do, this will be sufficient, and it's going to be more responsible when it comes to costs and timing, etc. as well. So thanks Ryan for adding that in, because I think that's a really good point. We have this temptation to go for all the detail and all the data, but sometimes it's just not necessary.
Absolutely. Sometimes the easiest to get data is the best to solve the problem that a company is facing. Yeah.
I mean, just from my experience also, sometimes if you go too granular for your use case, it also limits the breadth that you can cover, right? Mm-hmm. So in my past, we used to buy a lot of real estate sight unseen. If you're going to the meter length, right, that means you can't cover the entire United States. But if you up it, now you have much broader coverage for your use case.
Yeah, and I will say these days, time is such a luxury to have. So oftentimes, the speed we would like to have from data to insights just wouldn't even allow us to, kind of get the data to the most granular and accurate level we would like, which is fine, because at the end of the day, I think we just need good enough data to make decisions. We don't need like perfect data to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's interesting. Thank you all for your answers. So in your opinion, what are some of the new geospatial datasets that are driving innovation at the moment? What do you think are the most innovative datasets right now?
I can take this. At Kinetica, we've been seeing a lot of people not necessarily tackling new data sets, but taking old data sets and using them in new ways by joining them with newer data sets. I think the beauty of spatial data is that you have a natural join point, right? Latitude, longitude. So you can take lots of things that, for example, the government has collected, U.S. Geological Survey, NASA, NOAA, and that the government often even makes available for free, and join it for all brand new use cases. A great one that we did recently as a toy project was taking U.S. Geological Survey data on roads going up and down, and driving scenic routing based on that, right? And that's something where you're taking new data, map data, taking old data, elevation data that you're getting for free, and now you've just unlocked a new use case. And there's tons of other data sets like that, radar, space, infrared, vegetation, that can be unlocked and turned anew.
Yeah, something that we're seeing, Saif, as well, is that our customers, they also, bring in those third-party data sets or those other sources. One of them is Voy Technology. So they offer e-scooter sharing in cities, so they can drive really how people move around and change us from just being in cars by ourselves to actually using other forms of transport. And I had heard about their use case, and then I actually got to experience it myself. So I was in Berlin a month ago, and I got to use their scooters, and it made me physically think about all the data that's being created by me moving around and parking it in a certain location, and the data that they use to help make this user experience outstanding is they have an app, and they use external data about traffic regulations, speed limits, etc., but also like where you're allowed to park, so that when I open the app and I drop off my scooter and I'm finished with my trip, it shows me whether I'm allowed to park there or not. And it's such an easy thing for us as end users to be like, oh yeah, I'm not allowed to park here. It's really complex, I imagine, at the back end to achieve that. But what a great way to help your customers have a good experience, but also make it a good experience for you as the provider, because if the scooters are parked in a zone where they're not allowed to, they will probably incur a fine. So I think both the customer and the company win in that point. And yeah, I just love the innovative use of data there in really driving a new form of transport that I admittedly first was skeptical about, but when I experienced it myself, to see it's not just about getting from A to B in a really quick way. It's when you're in another city, it's so fun to see the sights faster without being underground or on a bus or something. So I think it makes for a completely new way of experiencing a new location.
Yeah, that's interesting, Eva. So sometimes it's not really the type of data you are using, but the use that you give that data, or how you cross that data with other data. And maybe it's data that it's been there for a very long time, like parking data or any other and how many companies are right now creating a lot of data, like the ones you were mentioning, the scooters and the ride-hailing companies, etc. Those companies are creating data all the time on how we move, where we go, what times, etc. So yeah, that I think that that new data from new sources basically is very interesting.
I would just throw out there a word of caution from some vendors we've worked with, is especially when they're getting into new data, be very careful about the claims that they're making. We've run into vendors where, for example, they say they're going to have nationwide data by end of year, but then every time you talk to them, the deadline keeps slipping. So if you know you need it by a certain time, I would say be very careful to rely on them simply saying they'll get it by then. If they don't already have it, make sure there's a big buffer. The flip side of that one too is if they're collecting one type of data and they think it can be processed in a novel way to get what you need, look into whatever partners they're trying to use to make that happen. Because we've seen examples where they're saying, yeah, we're working on that, we think we'll have it available. But then you look at the quality of the work the other company's using. For example, maybe that company's worked with satellite imagery before, but now you're trying to use imagery from flyovers by planes. But if they're not really getting good results with their prior data, don't expect that a new data set's magically going to fix that. So just be careful when you can't see for sure that they've got what you need in hand and the quality up front.
Yeah. And then I think like one of the tactics we have been using to make sure that those claims are true from the vendors is two things we always ask before we start working with someone. One is very clear documentation on the data, and then we usually also look for any documentation they have from internal testing of their data, because if someone kind of is really values the accuracy and quality of their data, they would perform extensive testing before giving that data set to the customer. And then the other thing we usually do is to ask for a data sample to do that due diligence ourselves as well. So, I think those are the two steps I will say we usually take that have helped us, I think, evaluate a lot of the potential new types of data sets before working with them at scale or before starting to develop solutions using those data sets. And then that's been, I will say, part of our process to date.
Yeah. One thing to remember is, I think for the audience especially, there's a lot of opportunity here for all sorts of vendors to come in and provide value-added layers to data sets, right? Especially to data sets like Ryan mentioned, satellite imagery, things that don't necessarily change on a high velocity basis. You have a lot of opportunities for vendors to come in and do it once, and for many of us to then harness that data, right? And the most interesting thing there is many of these data sets at the core level are free. So it makes for a good business case if you can handle the scale and compute required. And there's a lot of customers that can use it in all interesting ways.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next question. As we've mentioned before at the beginning, so data depends a lot on the use case or problem you are trying to solve. So this is a little bit like the chicken and egg question. Like, do you think like companies select, well, they have a problem and then they choose the data, or do they have the data and decide what problem to solve first with that data? And also, how does that influence the strategy of the company and the types of data that you are using?
Yeah, sure. So I can take this one since we work in a very unique industry called digital out-of-home. So I will say our use case is centered around understanding the movement patterns of consumers. So I will say, it kind of in our point of view, it doesn't really matter which one comes first. But before we start working on a new solution with a new data set, I think we definitely need a problem and use case to be clearly defined. So for example, as mentioned, we've worked and evaluated different types of data. And when we want to ask the question of, how are people moving around in the physical world, and what are the best times and places to reach this aggregated group of consumers, we are looking at definitely a balancing act between quality and precision, accuracy. So we've evaluated, for example, beacon data in the past. Beacon data is highly accurate, highly precise. However, for the question we want to ask around understanding consumers' movement patterns at scale, it's not really a good fit because the scale is simply not there. But if we instead want to ask the question of, can you tell me which aisle of a retail store this particular device is located, then I will say beacon data would be a great, sort of data set for answering that particular question. So I think for us, we really start with the questions to make sure, the data set we are looking at can sufficiently answer the questions we have. And then, once we know the data set is good enough, we can then act upon it. So I think for us, it doesn't really matter whether the data set comes first or the problem comes first. Mm-hmm. But before we start, putting resources toward that data set, we do want to have both clearly defined.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. Yeah.
Yeah, so I come from a world where usually the question comes first, and then the data comes if you don't already have the data to answer the question. So usually our biggest questions are around processing time and accuracy. So for example, if we're trying to work with building footprints, if you're going to trace every single little angle of a building, that's a lot of extra vertices to be interacting with it when it comes to geospatial processing. So you don't necessarily want every last detail, but if you also say, hey, we've placed this building give or take within a half block of where it actually is, that can be a problem too. So it's trying to find a right middle ground that meets the need. I would also say, especially if the data is coming from some sort of aggregator, make sure you understand whether the samples you're looking at are relatively representative of the overall quality. We made the mistake with one vendor specifically requesting data for Denver because that's where our team is based, and we figured, hey, our company doesn't actually operate in Denver. You won't mind giving us a sample here. But it just so happened that because they source from local governments, that Denver just happened to be one of the top 2 highest quality markets that they had. So essentially every single data set we cared about for any market we operated in was inherently worse than the Denver data we've been reviewing. So just be careful when working, especially with aggregated data, that you have a sense of what's the worst quality and what is kind of average quality, and make sure that they're not spoon feeding you or that you're accidentally asking for the best market that they've got.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Eva, Saif, you want to add?
I have to agree with Eugenie and Ryan on starting from the question. I think the way I see it at a really high level is the day-to-day business questions and the challenges we're trying to resolve would start with the question, and the data is sourced or already available and is used to answer the question. But I think where you might start with the data before you have a question is when you look at just these new kind of innovation projects where somebody might say, hey, we've hit this data set and I've been tinkering with it and I think we could do this. I think that's a situation where you have the data first. You might not have a clear question, but somebody has an idea. And then that idea might, it might fit an existing problem and solve that, but it might also just be something where like, we could just do something with it and see where that lands. And of course, for that, we need a bit of time and space to actually have those little experiments and those little side projects. But that's, I think, a situation where you could have the data without a clearly defined question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it really well. I mean, this is especially popular amongst some of the fastest users, like hedge funds, where there is a huge profit motive to profit from this data, and you often have a vague idea of what you need. And as new data comes, or as new vendors come and provide new layers on existing data, different things just go under the threshold of profitability or over the threshold, and now you can start using it. And I can talk about some interesting projects later on that we've done about this.
Yeah, that would be interesting. But let's move on to my next question. So this is one of I think the hardest part when talking about data. It's legal. So as privacy regulations become more relevant, how do you think this might impact certain data sources that you've been using or that you are willing to use at some point? Legal is always an issue, or can be an issue at some point. So how do you solve this?
Yeah, sure. So we've been through, I will say, multiple sort of like compliance programs at our company, because we do work with mobile location data, which consists of, for example, mobile advertising IDs. And as we also know that, these days, third-party cookies are also becoming more and more regulated. I will say, in our point of view, first, we think privacy regulations, or I will probably call them like consumer data protection initiatives, are positive as a whole, because at the end of the day, it's raising awareness about how consumers' data is being collected and used. And we definitely believe that consumers do have the rights to understand how their data is being used and collected. And then on the sort of side of the business, it's more about kind of also finding a balance between being irrelevant and then being creepy. Since you don't want to, make someone uncomfortable, but at the same time, as we are trying to provide good service, good content to consumers, we also want to provide value. Which means we do want to use, information that they know that we are collecting from them in a responsible manner to provide value and to still be relevant. And then on the data side, we do understand that, as consumers are more aware of how their data is being collected and used, there could be a decline in certain data sets that, like brands and advertisers rely on for understanding their behaviors today, which is totally fine. And I think we also feel like that is why data science exists as a discipline, because in order to understand, consumer behaviors, it's never about, as everyone is talking about, it's never about harnessing every single data point out there. It is really about having that representative sample to understand, this target group of consumers, customers that we are trying to provide services to. So I think data science becomes extremely important, because all the feature engineering, all the modeling, I will say part of it is to make sure that we are, doing our analysis. We are kind of developing insights based off of a representative sample. So, all in all, we think it's a good thing, and it probably will even, I will say, push the development of data science to help create that representative sample in the future.
Mm-hmm. Eva, Saif, Ryan, anything to add?
Just a quick thought is that you do have to make sure that you know when the rules are affecting your data sets. So for example, if you are operating nationwide and say rules in California may limit what data is available differently than New York versus Texas, you do need to at least know when your data may not be uniform across all areas. Working in mobile, one of our biggest examples is Android versus iOS. And we get far more information back on behavior of Android users. And so where the data science component comes in is if you really do have a black hole of understanding of iOS, how do you leverage Android data properly to try to account for the fact that it may not be 100% representative, but that it may be the main data that you can work with. But I do think it is important to have strong tie-ins with your legal departments, because frequently they are the ones that know about the new and upcoming changes, so that you can make sure you're in compliance and planning ahead.
Yeah. Eva, you were going to say something?
Just briefly, because I know we're going to come up on time, but I think it's also a matter of regularly assessing, do we actually need this data? Because I think, again, that a lot of companies, they're collecting a lot of data, and, fair enough, you're able to, so it's great. But what is the data you actually need? And at what point should you maybe get rid of some of the data for the sake of the customer and give them, the right to be forgotten? If they haven't engaged with your company in several years, maybe they're just not interested. So I think we need to just ask that question in regular intervals and say, are we using the data? And if not, do we even need it? Do we need to keep it? Except for, regulatory purposes, of course. But is there a reason why we're collecting this information about a customer if they're not really a customer or not anymore? So just something, I guess, I
absolutely
always to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that brings me to my last questions. We already have a few questions, but I'll keep them for the end. So, what are the benefits of turning to new types of data for spatial modeling? We've said that sometimes it's not new, but some cases it's like reimagined or crossed with different data sets. So what do you think? What are the benefits of this different uses or new data for spatial modeling?
I can take this. So I think some of the benefits are just all of the reimagined use cases, especially for use cases that may not drive profit necessarily. We had a really fun intern project this past summer where one of our interns, she didn't feel safe jogging at night. And we were like, well, what can we do about it? And we took two data sets, FCC's mobile phone coverage data and Washington, D.C. streetlight luminosity data. And we created an intelligent routing algorithm where you could say, hey, look, I want to only run on well-lit streets, or I want to only run in areas where I have mobile coverage. And again, actually, these were both free data sets. And it was a use case that, you don't necessarily sell to someone, but it's a good cause. It's a good product in a sense. And we were able to achieve that.
Yeah, and you are solving somebody's problem at that point. And I'm sure it's not the only person who has who's thinking about this.
Exactly.
So absolutely, if you can solve a problem, a person's problem or a company's problem, I think it's super relevant. No matter how small or how big the problem or the amount of people that are worried about it is, you are solving something. So yeah, I think that is a very good point.
Yeah, and I would just add that the big thing is just understanding what the upside is. If someone's asking you a question that's fairly minor and the outcome in the answer is not that important, then you're not going to go out and acquire an expensive data set just to be able to say you answered it. But on the flip side, a data set may seem expensive, but if the value behind the answer is there and you really can't get there another way, then don't shy away from the expense. it may be very justified to go down that path.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have a few questions. I'm going to go through the first one. So sometimes the issue is on how to process the data, which is absolutely right. If you have a live stream data, issue is on how to process the millions of points you get. What is the best tech or workflow to process this data? What do you think, Eva? I think this is a very good question for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a hard one to answer because there are so many factors that play into it. So, I could recommend all sorts of things, but without knowing the exact circumstances, the use cases, I think it would be irresponsible for me to make a blanket statement. But I do believe that having the right technology is really important, because otherwise, if you're not equipped with the right tools, it's kind of doomed to fail or to just kind of peter out, and you're not going to have much fun. So what I would say there is to be really thorough in assessing what is it you're trying to do, what do you have right now, and what's the gap, and understanding how you can fill the gap. And my recommendation is always to not just talk to the vendors, but really ask them for their help, because they, and I include us in there as well, they are the ones that know the technology the best, and they have so many things they can offer, and sometimes you might not know until you ask for it. So I'd say just go into it with your eyes open and getting the right information. I just don't want to make a blanket statement here for something where I have very little data to base it on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I probably would, I know Eva talks about, kind of communicating with the vendors. I think it's also very important to communicate with the customers or the stakeholders who are asking for, kind of that, data processing need, because oftentimes, there is currently what is possible and what is not possible. And then sometimes certain things, are outside of our own control. So, for example, we deal with, data latency issues all the time, and it's really not in our control, because our, vendors, they would have to deal with the latency that they get from their data providers. So oftentimes one is really about transparency and education with the customer, just, really helping them understand what is possible and what is not, but then still trying to come up with a solution. So for example, if we're trying to process, very large amount of data in real time for real-time decision making, today that is likely not possible. However, we can still use predictive modeling with that data, and then counting the latency issue in order to still help provide hopefully good enough directions on how the decision may be made. And as long as the customer and the stakeholders are okay with that, it may still be a good enough solution.
Yeah.
I mean, one last thing that I might mention is to think whether that is the secret sauce or not, right? Because some data you just need, but the true value is going to come downstream as you merge that data with other things and give your service to customers. In other cases, that data is the secret sauce. That might be, in investment management or in the intelligence community or somewhere. And in that case, you have to evaluate whether that's something that you're willing to take on, right? As opposed to working with a vendor who could potentially take on that work and sell it to you and sell it to others as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, keep in mind that sampling the data may be sufficient. It's important to understand, do you need every last point of data? Or if, for example, you only kept half the data points, would that still basically drive the same end answer, but save you half your compute time? And then on top of that, just know whether your tools are multi-threaded. If you're using a single CPU core on a server with 30 plus cores, that's a waste of that compute power. That might actually perform better on a desktop computer with just a really fast single-threaded capability. So it does come down to, yeah, matching the right hardware with the right software, with the right proportion of the data to make sure that you get the best result.
Yeah. And the second question we have is, have you ever been in a situation that certain data would be perfect for your model, and at that moment it is legal to harvest, but with your technical insights you had doubts if this use of data is ethical? Ethics, that's something that it's hard to say when it comes to data. Something is legal but might not be ethical, and vice versa. What do you think?
I think I'm just going to jump in here. I was hoping Eugenie would go first. I think if at any point you, as the data person, as a data scientist, have an ethical reservation about something, it's at least worthwhile talking to someone about it, because we have these kind of instincts for a reason, and I know instincts maybe not very scientific, but I think if you're not sure, if you're not 100% sure that you're comfortable using the data, then at least talk to someone first about it and get that second opinion, because I think bringing that up and having that discussion really helps flesh out what's the issue here, should we do it, should we not? I think it's important to stay true to your values, and if you think it's not ethical, then I would stay away from it.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Eva. I think I will say similarly. I think all of us, yes, we have legal, but legal is really just I think the last mile, just trying to make sure that the worst case scenario, right? In the worst case scenarios, you're protected. But then I think when it comes to ethical use of data, I do think we as a whole probably need more awareness around this topic. Because I even will say that sometimes what the data scientists and the practitioners may consider as ethical may not be considered, or may be considered ethical in the eyes of the end user or the consumers. So I think it's probably more important to have that conversation beyond just all the data privacy initiatives that we have been seeing, which, as mentioned before, I think that's a really good thing to have. But then that's just the starting point. I think we need more discussions about also ethical use of data beyond just compliant use, and just go beyond the legal baseline.
Yeah, thank you, Eugenie. So we have to close now. Thank you very much for your answers and insights. I think it was super interesting.